I had spent most of my adult life carving out stability with my own hands. My father left little more than unpaid debts when he died, and my mother did what she could with the scraps of his promises. From an early age, I learned that survival didn't wait for luck, and prosperity wasn't inherited. It was built brick by brick, hour by hour, until you had something solid under your feet. By the time my son, Daniel, was born, I had already begun shaping a company from nothing more than a service truck and a stubborn refusal to quit. Over the years, that company became my fortress and my pride. It paid for Daniel's schooling, his sports teams, his college tuition. Every milestone he reached, I felt as though I had climbed it too, except the weight was always on my back. He never asked where the money came from. He just lived inside the shelter of it. That was why the evening he came to me about his wedding felt less like a conversation and more like an ambush. We were sitting at my dining table, the same one where I had helped him with algebra when he was 12, where we'd celebrated birthdays with cake and cheap balloons, and where, in later years, I ate alone more often than not. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a look I couldn't quite place. It wasn't excitement, not really. It was expectation, maybe entitlement. "Dad," he said, "I need you to help fund the wedding. We're looking at venues, and the costs are serious. But since you're my father, and you've always wanted what's best for me, I know you'll come through." His words were rehearsed, like he had already counted the money in his mind before asking me. I stared at him across that table, and for a long moment, I said nothing. The air between us was tight, heavy. I thought about all the times I had already said yes to him. "Yes, I'll pay your car insurance. Yes, you can live in my house rent-free until you're settled. Yes, I'll give you a job even though you haven't earned it the way others had to." My entire relationship with my son had become a string of yeses tied together by guilt and fatherly duty. And suddenly, the idea of another yes tasted bitter in my mouth. "Daniel," I finally said, my voice steady but cold, "I won't be paying for this wedding. I've supported you enough. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. His smile dropped as though I had spoken a foreign language. "What do you mean you won't pay?" he snapped, leaning forward now, his voice sharp in a way I wasn't used to hearing. "You've got the money. Don't sit there and pretend you don't. This is my wedding, Dad. If you loved me, you'd want to be part of it. You'd want to give your son a proper start." His words cut deep, not because they were true, but because he believed them. He looked at me not as his father, but as a bank that had suddenly closed. And in that moment, I realized he saw my sacrifices not as love, but as obligations, things he was entitled to by birthright. I swallowed hard, feeling a heat rise in my chest, but I held my ground. "Love doesn't mean writing checks on command," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "I've given you more than enough. You have a good job because of me. You have a roof over your head because of me. If that's not enough, then you need to ask yourself why." My voice cracked slightly on the last word, not from weakness, but from the weight of decades pressing against me. He didn't flinch, didn't soften. Instead, his lips curled into something almost sneering. "Well then," he said coldly, pushing back from the table, "if you won't support me, then you don't get to be part of this family. Don't bother showing up to the wedding. You can forget about calling my kids your grandchildren, because as far as I'm concerned, you don't deserve that title." He stood, towering over me in a way that reminded me of how small I had once seemed to him when he was a boy. I searched his face for some flicker of hesitation, some trace of the child who used to look up to me. But all I saw was resentment and finality. For a moment, I wanted to argue, to grab him by the shoulders and shake him out of his madness. But then something inside me went still, like a pond after a storm. I realized no words would matter. He had already made his choice. So I did the one thing he didn't expect. I smiled. Not out of joy, not even out of peace, but out of a grim acknowledgement of the line he had drawn. Without a word, I stood, walked past him, and left the room. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of his scoff, followed by the door slamming as he left the house. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was clarity. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the irony of it all. I had worked my entire life to give my son more than I ever had, believing that generosity would breed gratitude. Instead, it had bred entitlement. He didn't just want my support, he demanded it, as though my role was to supply and his role was to take. And when I refused, he didn't hesitate to cut me out like a stranger. The pain of his words lingered, but beneath it was something else, something harder and sharper: resolve. If he truly believed I had no place in his new life, then perhaps it was time I took him at his word. The weeks that followed our confrontation unfolded in a strange haze of quiet. Daniel did not call, and I did not reach out either. It was as though the air between us had frozen solid, brittle, and unforgiving. At first, I told myself it was temporary. He needed time to cool off, to think about what he had said, to realize the gravity of telling his own father that he had no right to attend his wedding or know his grandchildren. But days turned into weeks, and the silence thickened, pressing down on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had always thought that age and experience gave me immunity to hurt, but I discovered that nothing pierced deeper than the words of your own child spoken in anger. Even the clinking of dishes at dinner felt louder in that silence, like a reminder that the table I once shared with family now belonged only to me. I confided in my sister, Margaret, one evening over the phone. She had always been the one person who could listen without judgment, though she never shied from honesty. "You've coddled that boy too long," she said, her voice steady, laced with a kind of matter-of-fact truth that made me wince. "You gave him everything, and he thinks the world owes him the same. This wedding business isn't about love or family, it's about control. He wants to measure your loyalty with dollar signs." I didn't want to admit she was right, but deep down, her words aligned with the unease I had carried for years. I had been aware, in some shadowy part of my mind, that Daniel had grown too comfortable in my safety net, but I always convinced myself it was what fathers were supposed to do: make life easier for their children. Perhaps I had mistaken ease for love, generosity for good parenting, and now I was reaping the bitter harvest. As the third week approached, I wrestled with a gnawing curiosity. Despite the hurt, I couldn't ignore the practical truth: my son was still getting married. Somewhere, plans were being finalized, vows rehearsed, flowers arranged, and yet I had no idea when or where it would all unfold. Pride told me to stay silent, but a small, aching part of me still wanted to be included, even if only in knowledge. So one evening, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. It rang longer than usual, and when he finally answered, his tone was clipped. "What do you want, Dad?" The word "dad" sounded foreign, distant, as though it belonged to a role he no longer acknowledged. I cleared my throat, steadying myself. "I just wanted to know the date of your wedding," I said quietly. "That's all. I don't need an invitation. I just wanted to know." There was a long pause on his end, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of voices in the background. Then, with a sharp edge of disdain, he replied, "It already happened. 2 weeks ago." My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean it already happened?" I asked, stunned. He didn't soften, didn't hesitate. Exactly what I said. The wedding was 2 weeks ago. Everyone was there: Mom, Uncle Steve, the cousins. Everyone but you. Because you made your choice. His voice carried no remorse, only a kind of cruel satisfaction, as though leaving me out had been his final triumph. I sat frozen, the silence on my end stretching into something unbearable. "I see," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Well, congratulations, then." I ended the call before he could respond, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying his words again and again. 2 weeks ago, everyone was there. Everyone but you. The exclusion wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, orchestrated to humiliate me, to make a statement. He hadn't just cut me off. He had erased me, scrubbed me from a moment that should have been about family and unity. And what hurt most wasn't that I had missed the wedding. It was that nobody else had thought to tell me. Not one relative had picked up the phone. Not one person had whispered, "You should know." It felt as though they had all conspired in silence, watching from the sidelines as my son carved me out of his new life like I was an unwelcome stain. The following morning, Margaret came by unannounced, carrying a bag of groceries as though she sensed I hadn't been eating properly. She took one look at me, saw the exhaustion etched in my face, and asked, "You found out, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to find the words. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice softening. "But maybe now you'll stop pretending he's the boy you raised. He's a man now, and he's made his choice. You don't have to keep bleeding for someone who won't even acknowledge you." Her words stung, but they also lit something inside me. She was right. I didn't need to keep bleeding. If my son had decided I had no place in his new life, then perhaps it was time I ensured he had no place in mine. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, the walls echoing back my thoughts. For so long, Daniel's comfort had been my priority, but what had it cost me? My peace, my dignity, my place in my own family. I thought about the job I had given him in my company, the house he lived in rent-free, the security he never earned but always enjoyed. Suddenly, those things felt less like gifts and more like chains. If he believed I had no right to stand beside him at his wedding, then why should he enjoy the privileges that came only because he was my son? That evening, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, drafting decisions that would ripple through both our lives. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been weeks before. I was resolved, sharp, clear. He wanted to build a life without me. Very well. Let him see what that truly meant. The morning after I learned about the wedding was strangely calm, almost eerily so. I expected to wake up with fury bubbling inside me, but instead, I felt a cold steadiness, like a man who had already buried his grief and was ready to move forward. For weeks I had allowed myself to wallow in uncertainty, wondering whether I had been too harsh in refusing to fund the wedding, whether perhaps I should have compromised for the sake of peace. But after hearing that my son had not only excluded me, but celebrated the most important day of his life while ensuring my absence, I understood something with complete clarity. Daniel no longer saw me as his father. I had been reduced to a wallet, and when the wallet closed, he discarded me without hesitation. That realization hardened me, and I knew what had to be done. The first step was the company. Daniel had been working under my roof for years, occupying a position he neither earned nor valued. I had hired him out of loyalty, a desire to give him a steady foundation, believing that working beside me might instill in him the discipline and grit it had taken me decades to build. But instead, his presence at the company became a liability. He coasted on his last name, expected promotions without merit, and ignored the quiet resentment of employees who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. That morning, I drafted his termination letter myself. My hand didn't tremble as I signed it. The words were professional, but their weight carried a personal truth. Daniel's privilege existed only because of me, and if he no longer acknowledged me as family, then he had no right to the fruits of that bond. Delivering the letter was a moment I'll never forget. I called him into my office, the same office where he had once sat as a boy playing with paperclips while I finished late paperwork. He entered casually, shoulders squared with the arrogance of someone who thought their position was untouchable. I slid the envelope across the desk. "What's this?" he asked, frowning. "Read it," I said. He tore it open, scanned the contents, and then looked up at me with disbelief. "You're firing me? You're firing your own son." His voice cracked with outrage, but there was no sorrow in it, only entitlement, as though the very idea was an offense to the natural order. I met his stare, unblinking. "I hired you because you were my son." That was a privilege, not a right, and privileges can be revoked. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Daniel's face twisted with anger. "You're unbelievable. First the wedding, now this? You want to ruin my life because I didn't bow down to you? You've lost it, Dad. You're going to regret this." His words were venom, but they rolled off me. For once, I felt no urge to explain, no instinct to defend myself. I simply nodded toward the door. "Your desk is cleared by the end of the day." Watching him storm out, his footsteps heavy with rage, I felt a pang of sorrow, but beneath it was relief. Relief that I had finally cut the cord I should have severed long ago. But I wasn't done. That afternoon, I sat down with my attorney and began the process of restructuring my will. For years, Daniel had been the primary beneficiary, inheriting not only my wealth, but also the company I had poured my blood into. It had been my hope that he would carry forward the legacy, preserving what I built. But now I understood he would only squander it, treating it as just another resource to drain until it was empty. The thought of my life's work falling into his careless hands was unbearable. So I removed his name. Every asset, every account, every property, his inheritance evaporated with a few strokes of ink. Instead, I redirected my estate toward charitable trusts, distant relatives who had never asked me for a dime, and employees who had shown me more loyalty than my own son. The hardest decision came with the house. Daniel had been living in one of my properties rent-free, a gesture I once thought of as fatherly generosity. But now, it felt like another chain binding me to someone who had already cut me loose. My lawyer prepared the eviction papers, and as I signed them, I thought about how many nights I had convinced myself it was temporary, that he just needed time to get on his feet. Years had passed, and he was still standing on my shoulders instead of his own two legs. Taking that house back wasn't about revenge. It was about finally ending the cycle of dependency I had created with my own hands. When the papers were delivered, Daniel called me in a fury. "You're taking the house too? What the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was raw, filled with disbelief. "Do you want me homeless? Is that it? You want to watch me fail so you can feel like you won?" I listened quietly, letting his anger wash over me. When he paused for breath, I said calmly, "No, Daniel. I want you to stand on your own for once in your life. If you see that as failure, then that's your choice. But I won't be your crutch anymore." His response was a string of curses before the line went dead. I set the phone down gently, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I reflected on the weight of my decisions. They weren't easy, and they weren't made in anger, though Daniel would surely tell everyone otherwise. They were made because love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's servitude. And I realized I had been serving my son at the expense of my own dignity for far too long. Revoking his privileges wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation. I had given him every chance to rise, and instead, he chose to drag me down. Now, he would have to face life without the safety net he had always taken for granted. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within days of Daniel's termination and the eviction notice, the phone calls began. First it was my brother, Steve, whose voice carried that familiar blend of irritation and half-baked diplomacy. "You really went and fired your own son?" he demanded, as though the news itself was too outrageous to be true. "And the house too? Come on, that's extreme, don't you think?" I could almost hear the whispers he must have heard at the wedding, the murmurs of cousins and relatives who were only too happy to feast on gossip. My refusal to fund the wedding had already painted me as stubborn, but now, with Daniel cast adrift, I was the villain in the story they preferred to believe. I let Steve speak his piece, then replied calmly, "I did what I had to do. He made his choices, and I made mine. You weren't the one cut out of your own son's wedding. Until you know what that feels like, don't tell me how to respond." My brother muttered something under his breath before hanging up, leaving me with nothing but the hollow click of the line going dead. The calls didn't stop there. My ex-wife, Linda, rang the next day, her tone sharp with accusation. "I don't know what you think you're proving, but you're destroying Daniel's life. He just got married, for God's sake, and instead of supporting him, you're tearing everything away. Don't you care what this does to him? Don't you care about your future grandchildren?" Her words dripped with the kind of guilt I had grown immune to over the years, but they still hit me in the chest. For a brief moment, I remembered the younger version of her, the woman who once stood beside me when Daniel was a toddler, when we still shared dreams of raising him into someone better than either of us. But that version of Linda was long gone, replaced by someone who enabled Daniel's entitlement at every turn. "I do care," I said slowly, carefully. "But caring doesn't mean enabling. If you want to keep cushioning him, that's your choice. I won't anymore." She scoffed, muttered, "You'll die a bitter old man," and hung up before I could answer. I should have expected the wider family to join the chorus. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly called, their voices sugary sweet at first, only to sour once the real subject surfaced. "Maybe you should have just given a little for the wedding," one cousin suggested, her tone laced with judgment. "Family is about sacrifices, isn't it?" I bit back the urge to laugh bitterly. Sacrifices. I had spent decades bleeding myself dry for Daniel, and now I was being lectured about sacrifice by people who hadn't lifted a finger to support him when he needed it. I realized, in that moment, that many of them didn't care about the truth. They cared about the story that was easiest to believe, the hardened father who abandoned his son over money. It was simpler to villainize me than to acknowledge the years of entitlement that led us here. But the backlash didn't just live in private calls. It spread publicly too. On social media, photos from Daniel's wedding appeared, perfectly staged images of smiling faces, toasts raised, a family gathered in unity. And in the captions, the unspoken wound was made clear. A perfect day surrounded by the people who matter most. I knew the line wasn't written for me, but it might as well have been. I scrolled through the comments late one night, reading the flood of congratulations, the endless remarks about how beautiful the day was. Not a single soul asked why I was missing, but I could feel the whispers beneath it all, the speculation. The absence of my face in those photos screamed louder than any words could. Then came the voicemail. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, when the house was still and I was pouring myself a drink to quiet the storm in my head. Daniel's voice was thick with anger, his words slurred slightly, as though he'd been drinking. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "You think taking my job and the house makes you powerful? You ruined my life over a wedding." "A wedding, Dad? You're pathetic. Everyone sees it. Everyone knows you're just a bitter old man who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. You'll regret this when you're alone and forgotten." The message ended with the harsh beep of finality. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the phone, the venom of his words sinking into me like ice. But beneath the sting, I felt something else, strangely, a sense of liberation. He had said the quiet part out loud. This was never about love, never about family. It was about power, about control, about the belief that I owed him everything simply because I was his father. Despite my resolve, there were nights I lay awake wondering if I had gone too far. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, running down the driveway with scraped knees, or falling asleep in the back seat after baseball games. Those memories made the present all the more painful. How had the boy I raised become the man who now hurled such venom at me? The temptation to second-guess myself was strong, but every time I considered softening, I reminded myself of the facts. He excluded me from his wedding. He erased me from the most important day of his life. He told me I had no right to call his children my grandchildren. And then he turned around and still expected me to bankroll his future. If I yielded now, I would be confirming everything he believed, that my love was conditional on how much money I was willing to spend. One evening, Margaret visited again. She listened as I told her about the backlash, about Linda's accusations and Daniel's venomous voicemail. When I finished, she placed her hand on mine and said softly, "You're not wrong for standing up for yourself. Everyone else can't see it because they weren't the ones cut out. They didn't sit in the silence you did. But I see it. And someday he'll have to see it too. Until then, you can't let him dictate your worth." Her words steadied me in a way nothing else had. It reminded me that while I might be cast as the villain in Daniel's story, I didn't have to be the villain in my own. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. I put into words the truth I had been circling around but never said aloud. I had lost my son long before the wedding. The man who stood before me demanding money wasn't the boy I once raised. That boy was gone, replaced by someone who saw me only as a means to an end. Accepting that truth was painful, but it also freed me. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of peace in knowing that I no longer had to chase after his approval or beg for my place in his life. He had shut that door, and I was finally willing to walk away from it. A few weeks after the storm of phone calls and angry messages had subsided, I received an invitation to a small family gathering. It wasn't anything significant, just my cousin's birthday, a casual dinner with relatives I rarely saw. At first, I considered declining. My name had been dragged through enough mud lately, and I suspected my presence would only stir whispers. But something inside me pushed me to go. Maybe I wanted to remind them I wasn't hiding, that I wasn't ashamed. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted to see for myself just how much I had been erased from the fabric of this family. The dinner was held at a modest banquet hall, nothing extravagant, but the air buzzed with chatter and laughter. As I walked in, I felt the shift immediately. Eyes turned toward me, some warm, some cold, and some simply curious, as though I were a rare animal stepping out of the shadows. A few relatives greeted me politely, with the kind of surface-level niceties that masked judgment. Others avoided eye contact altogether. I had expected as much, but it still stung. I found a seat toward the end of the long table, listening as conversations swirled around me. That was when I saw them, photos from Daniel's wedding, framed and sitting proudly on the dessert table for everyone to admire. My stomach tightened as I walked over, pretending to browse the desserts. The pictures were beautiful, I won't deny that. Daniel and his bride stood beneath a canopy of flowers, their smiles broad, their arms entwined. The family surrounded them in photo after photo, uncles, cousins, even distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone looked radiant, celebrating together. But in one picture, the irony hit me like a punch. It was a shot of the head table, elegantly decorated, where the couple sat in the middle, surrounded by loved ones. And at the very end, there was an empty seat, an accidental gap where someone should have been. My seat. Whether they realized it or not, the absence was glaring to me, a ghost of what should have been. I stood staring at that photo longer than I should have, my throat tightening. My cousin's teenage daughter, a quiet, observant girl, came up beside me. She glanced at the photo, then looked at me with hesitation. "It wasn't right what he did," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Everyone pretends like it's fine, but it wasn't. We noticed you weren't there. We missed you." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I had to steady myself against the table. It wasn't much, but it was something, a flicker of validation in a sea of silence. I managed a small smile and nodded. "Thank you," I whispered back. It wasn't just gratitude. It was relief, a reminder that not everyone had swallowed Daniel's version of events whole. Later in the evening, I sat quietly while relatives swapped stories and laughter. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed, but I could live with that. I thought about how strange it was, being both part of the family and yet apart from it. The empty seat in the wedding photo lingered in my mind. It was a symbol, really, not just of my exclusion from the wedding, but of a larger truth. I had been creating an empty seat in Daniel's life for years without realizing it. By giving too much, by enabling him, I had left no space for him to grow into his own man. That empty chair represented both what I had lost and what I had refused to see until it was too late. As I drove home that night, the streets quiet under the glow of streetlights, I wrestled with a new ache. The grandchildren I might never know. Daniel's voice echoed in my head. "You can forget about calling my kids your grandchildren too." That sentence had haunted me since the night he said it. At the time, I thought it was just anger, words thrown out in the heat of confrontation. But after seeing those photos, after realizing just how deliberate my erasure had been, I knew he meant it. He had drawn a boundary, sharp and merciless, and the cost was more than just missing one wedding. It was missing first birthdays, first steps, school graduations, entire lives unfolding without me. The thought hollowed me out, but I refused to let it break me. If Daniel thought he could weaponize my love for my future grandchildren, then he underestimated me. Love does not mean surrendering your dignity. In the days that followed, I replayed that cousin's daughter's words in my head. "We missed you." They were simple, but they reminded me that truth has a way of surfacing, even in whispers. Maybe the wider family believed I was cruel. Maybe they painted me as a bitter man who cut off his son over money, but there would always be someone who saw through the smoke. And one day, perhaps Daniel's own children would see too. Not because I'd forced the story on them, but because lies have short legs, and eventually the truth always outruns them. I had to believe that. It was the only way to keep from drowning in regret. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where this entire storm had begun, and wrote down my reflections in my journal. I wrote about the empty chair in the photo, about the validation from my cousin's daughter, about the ache of being erased, but also the strange sense of relief that came with boundaries. "Love without limits becomes slavery," I wrote. "And I am no man's slave, not even my son's." Closing the journal, I felt a quiet sorrow, but it was tempered with resolve. The ache would linger, yes, but it would not undo me. Months passed after that family dinner, and slowly, the noise around me quieted. The barrage of phone calls had stopped, the whispers faded into the background, and even Daniel's venom seemed to have burned itself out. What remained was silence, but unlike before, it was no longer suffocating. It was almost welcome. My life, once wrapped up in my son's demands and expectations, began to take on a rhythm of its own again. I poured more of my energy into the company, restructuring it to thrive without nepotism dragging it down. Employees who had quietly resented Daniel's shortcuts now flourished in their roles, and productivity climbed in ways I hadn't seen in years. Watching the business grow without the weight of favoritism confirmed what I already knew. Removing Daniel had been painful, but it had also been necessary. The house I had taken back became a rental property, bringing in steady income rather than draining my patience. I found satisfaction in renovating it, transforming it from a place of entitlement into a symbol of independence. Every brushstroke of paint, every repaired fixture, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost in years of enabling. Some evenings I would drive past the house and glance at it, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of closure. It no longer represented Daniel's stubborn refusal to grow up. It was simply an asset, one I managed with clear eyes. In that way, I began to disentangle my identity from him, realizing that while he was my son, he didn't have to define the rest of my life. Still, the ache lingered. I would sit at my dining table and sometimes imagine what it might have been like to stand at his wedding, to give a speech filled with pride, to watch my son take his vows with me at his side. I imagined holding my grandchildren, hearing their laughter fill the halls of my house. These images haunted me, not because I believed they were still possible, but because I knew they had been stolen from me. Daniel's choice had left an empty seat at my table just as much as it had at his wedding. And yet, despite that ache, I reminded myself daily that dignity had to cost something. Boundaries meant sacrifice, and I was not going to betray myself just to have scraps of inclusion thrown my way. It was around this time, on a quiet afternoon, that I received something unexpected in the mail. A plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a city I knew Daniel lived near. I opened it cautiously, and inside was a single card. No words were written, no message inside. Instead, it contained a photograph of a baby bundled in soft blankets, tiny fists curled against chubby cheeks. My grandchild. There was no signature, no acknowledgement, nothing to bridge the divide. Just the photo, slipped into an envelope and mailed without explanation. I sat at my table staring at it for what felt like hours, emotions warring within me. Part of me wanted to weep for what I was missing. Another part wanted to believe this was Daniel's way of reaching out, a subtle crack in the wall he had built. And yet another part of me felt the temptation to rush back, to beg for entry into this new chapter of his life. But I didn't. I held that photo in my hands, studied every detail of that tiny face, and allowed myself the bittersweet taste of joy mixed with sorrow. This was the redemptive gesture, small and silent, but a gesture nonetheless. Someone, whether Daniel or his wife, had chosen to send it. That meant I hadn't been erased entirely, even if the door remained locked. But I also knew this didn't change the truth. The photo was not an invitation, not a reconciliation, not a request for my return. It was a moment of humanity, nothing more. I decided then that I would not chase it. If they wanted me in that child's life, they knew where to find me. Until then, I would love from afar, silently but firmly, without surrendering my boundaries. In the weeks that followed, I kept the photo tucked inside my journal. Every so often, I would take it out and look at it, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of what I had chosen. I had chosen dignity over submission, boundaries over enabling. And even if it meant missing birthdays and milestones, I knew I could live with myself. Because the alternative, allowing Daniel to dictate my worth, to treat me like a bank instead of a father, would have hollowed me out entirely. I wasn't willing to live as a shadow in my own life. No, I had chosen peace, even if it came in broken pieces. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the floor, I reflected on everything that had happened. The boy I had once carried on my shoulders was gone, replaced by a man I no longer recognized. That truth would never stop hurting, but I had stopped letting it define me. I understood now that love, even for your own child, must have boundaries. Without them, love curdles into resentment, and resentment destroys both parent and child alike. My decision had cost me a son, yes, but it had given me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost, my own self-respect. That was a trait I could live with. So I closed my journal that night with one final line. Peace doesn't come whole. It comes in pieces, and you take what you can, knowing it's enough. And that's where I left it. Choosing dignity over dependency, even if it cost me my own son. I know some of you will say I went too far, while others will understand why I drew the line. But now I want to hear from you. If your child erased you from their wedding and their life, would you fight to stay in it? Or would you let go the way I did? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story struck something in you, make sure to subscribe for more stories about the hard truths we face in family. See you soon in the next story.